Forgiveness, as many of you know, this might be review for some, is a decision to release someone from an offense that they have made against you. A key word to point out here is decision. Forgiveness is not necessarily always a feeling. It may be accompanied by a feeling, but it is in large part a decision to release someone from an offense of theirs against you. In the biblical world and in today's world, God seems to view the ways in which humans interact with one another in such a way that every action one human being does against another matters. That words that are spoken to and about other humans, gestures that are made, things that are done from one party to another don't just happen and then kind of disappear into a vacuum, but they last, they have effect. And medical science and psychologists and all others have time and time again just reaffirmed these basic truths that are within the biblical world, even to the point that trauma is, and we've talked about this before in this class, is housed in the body, that things don't just leave after they have been committed, but they have real and lasting effects. And so when you wade into the waters of forgiveness, you're making a decision to let the offense of someone go, to release them from it. Now, this is important to clarify. In the mind of Jesus of Nazareth, forgiveness is not a call to gloss over sin or offense. I recently was having a conversation about this with a student. She has had some terrible things happen to her from one particular member of her family, and she's wrestling with forgiveness. And, she was asking me about these things that Jesus says about forgiveness and loving enemies, and how is that possible, and this and that. And one of the things that I wanted to put her at ease on is Jesus is not calling anyone to just kind of shrug their shoulders and be like, well, no big deal, I forgive you. It's not an obnoxious, immature, I'm just not going to think about it, let it go and move on ordeal. The Bible takes very seriously, and we've talked about this before too, but it is worth saying again. The Bible takes very seriously the process of human emotions when you have been wounded or offended by another party. It also takes very seriously, in many cases, necessary steps that need to be taken in order for justice to be served. And so it is very easy to misrepresent the words of Jesus or to take verses like this from the Bible out of their biblical context and basically just kind of say to people, well, you just need to get over it because the Bible says forgive. Well, the Bible is never just calling people to quote unquote get over it in the way that we might just want to rush people to that point. As the song pointed out, people are the best and the worst that God has created. I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you have been hurt by people that you trusted, people that you were counting on, people that gave you their word, people that portrayed themselves to be one way. And after some period of time, maybe years, all of a sudden you look up and, oh no, here is a knife in my back from this person whom I trusted. In many cases, the pain that hurts the worst are from those individuals that you trusted the most, close family members, close friends. And don't let money get involved, right? Or the deepest affections of love and romance, or kids being involved, or marriage. The wounds run deep And every single person in this class has some kind of wound or wounds from people. And you know someone who has wound or wounds from people. The people that you sit, well, maybe not, as much these days, but, people that you sit next to on a train or a bus or in a church service or a movie theater, all are dealing with people wounds. And so I just really want to clarify, Jesus is not telling anyone to, just get over it, no big deal. That would be deeply insensitive and hurtful of Jesus, in fact, to say to someone, just get over it. And this is important to say too. Forgiveness is not necessarily an equivalent of reconciliation. So I like to say that forgiveness and reconciliation are cousins, but you can have one without the other. Now, again, in the moving towards language of the kingdom of God, okay, we've been using moving towards language for weeks now. Jesus's ultimate vision is for everyone to move toward full reconciliation. But you might not have full reconciliation at the very moment when you have forgiveness. Okay, forgiveness, as we see above, is that decision to release someone from offense. I can decide to release someone from offense and we yet not be reconciled. Why? Well, because reconciliation is when two parties were joined together as one, something broke them apart and they were split, and then they come back together again as one. For example, if, God forbid, I were driving my car down the road and a truck were to come and hit the front of my car and just completely, let's just say rip off the bumper or something, and I were to be towed in the remainder of my car and my bumper to the mechanic, and the mechanic were to take the bumper of my car and the rest of the body of my car and put it back together again, what he or she would be doing is reconciling my car. It once was whole, it was split apart into two, it's back now together as whole. This is why, actually, this is just a side note, racial reconciliation may or may not always be the best phrase when we talk about race relations in this country, because in some way that suggests that at one point there was a unity of all races in this country, which may or may not be true. When you are reconciling, you are bringing something that was one but split back together. If it was split at the get-go, it's not necessarily a reconciling. It may just be a conciliation, be that as it may. When we start to think about how deep wounds can be for men and women in the church, out of the church, okay, but really focusing here on the church, because again, this is about the covenant kingdom community. Jesus does not expect every single person who has been wounded to just immediately be back in close relationship with the person who wounded them. Sometimes it is necessary for there to be distance, whether that be for that individual's safety or mental health or whatever the case may be. And so the call to forgive is not necessarily a call to be buddy friends again. We hang out with each other, come over to my house, blah, blah, blah. I can decide to release someone from an offense and we still necessarily not rekindle friendship. And that is a mark of spiritual maturity. Now, again, ultimately, it is the most kingdom ideal that there is reconciliation, but that may or may not happen at the same time of forgiveness. Here's another thing to point out for forgiveness. Forgiveness equals healing for the offended and the offender. It has been said many times by many people in many ways that when you decide to forgive, it is actually best for you in that moment. Sometimes even more than the person whom you are forgiving. Because in that moment, again, you are releasing that offense which you have been carrying from the other person. And depending on how deep the offense is or how long you've been carrying it, you may literally feel that change in your body when you decide to let someone go from their offense. Here's the last thing to point out about forgiveness before we move on. It takes time. Forgiveness is not an overnight ordeal. I mean, it might be if something was super minor, like you used the last of the barbecue sauce and didn't leave me any. I might be able to forgive you in 12 hours when I wake up and have some coffee. But for wounds that run much deeper than barbecue sauce, it takes time. And again, remember the character of Jesus, of our God. He is not one to aggressively or insensitively just say, well, get over it. It's no big deal. It really, really, really takes time. It takes emotional processing. It may take therapy, prayer, fasting, all of the above to get to the point when you can release someone from offense. And then it may take even more time to get to the point where you can reconcile with them. The last thing I'll say about reconciliation is forgiveness only requires one of the parties to make a decision. Reconciliation requires both parties to be involved in the decision making. This is another reason why reconciliation is a little bit more complicated than forgiveness. Okay, I can decide to forgive someone and they may or may not receive that or decide to forgive me if I offended them, whatever the case may be. I can make that individual decision within myself. I cannot, however, be reconciled to someone unless we both come to the table and say, let's be reconciled. I also just want to point out in the preceding verses above the parable of the unforgiving servant on the subject of offense, reconciliation, forgiveness, we have some basic protocols and principles for how members in this covenant kingdom community are to go about handling conflict. And I'm almost positive that every person in this class is already familiar with this. It's a class of pretty seasoned and mature saints, but I'm just going to read it. And if anyone has any questions or comments about this or anything else I've just said, feel free to share. So look with me at verse 15 of Matthew chapter 18. Verse 15 of Matthew chapter 18. This is how the Bible reads, Jesus speaking. If your brother sins against you. Notice here that Jesus does not say, if your brother sins against me or against my Father. He says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Be upfront, confront him, be direct, don't be passive aggressive. Put it out in the open. When you did this, I felt like this. It hurt me. It belittled me. It embarrassed me. It cost me. Say it. Between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen, even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. In other words, like kind of what Paul would say, release him to the devil. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. That phrase is being repeated here, and it's very interesting that it's being repeated within the context of relationships in the kingdom of God, binding and loosing. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Also interesting that that verse, which gets quoted quite often for varying reasons, was also originally stated within the context of offense in relationships. So one thing I'll just kind of point out about this before I just open up the floor for any questions or comments we have, is the first part of the process. And I think in today's climate, and I don't want to get on a soapbox here, so I'm going to keep this short. This protocol, this principle of going to someone directly and having that A and B hard conversation in which you speak honestly out loud about the ways in which that individual's actions were harmful to you is arguably the most missing component in not only our public life, but oftentimes, not this church, okay, but in the life of the capital C church. It is far easier to bypass that direct conversation and just put someone on blast on Facebook or on Instagram or on Twitter, whether that be by, directly calling them out or tagging them, okay, in the comment section, or just by posting, just really passive aggressive, statuses or sharing memes or innuendos and all this stuff that everyone knows who you're talking about, you know what I mean? Or they don't know who someone is talking about, but they know that you're talking about someone. And it's just very clear that you have not you, but others have not had that private A and B conversation. And one of the things that I see in the text is Jesus seems to think that a lot of issues can be resolved in that step. The way that I read the progression of the text is when we get to verse 16 and it says, but if he does not listen, it's as if he's communicating that, okay, that individual is somewhat of an exception. And then verse 17, if he refuses to listen to the witnesses, okay, go to the church. And if he doesn't even listen to the church, I think what Jesus is trying to communicate is like, and those people are out there, but those are like really difficult people. Most people, or with most people at least, things can be resolved at step A. And a lot of the times why things blow up and become so much bigger than honestly they might need to be, or why offense lingers and ends up seeping into unforgiveness and bitterness and so forth, is because that A and B conversation didn't happen. The floor is open. What questions, comments do you have about this?
I was just going to bring out that for some reason, I don't, as many times as I've heard this scripture 15, if your brother sins against you, not against God. I mean, the rest of it makes sense, but that was just, it just hit me a little differently today.
Yeah, that's certainly not a category in which a lot of us think that we are capable of sinning against another human.
Right.
Yeah, very similarly to, the dynamic between sinning against God and sinning against people. Like take Joseph, for example, when Potiphar's wife was trying to seduce him, and he says, I won't commit this act because I'll be sinning against God. And in that moment, we see the relationship between an action to a person being an offense to God. And here we see that the opposite almost, that things that are also offensive to God are sins against people. So it's that tight connection. But yeah, wonderful observation. Others, questions, comments about any of this? The parable, the protocols, the things you see on screen?
I have a comment. Okay, so I personally have been in a situation where I didn't necessarily go those 3 steps of talking to the individual, then taking it to the church or taking it to the elders, but I did the one-on-one. And even though at that moment it seemed like everything was resolved, it was the individual did something. You know how you have a scab coming on a sore, and then when it doesn't heal all the way, you pull the scab and you reopen it all over again. And it's like, that just took me to the part where, we're supposed to forgive 70 times, 7 times. And it's like, well, why do they keep scratching the scab? Why do they keep scratching the scab, keep reopening that wound? And it actually makes you just not want to be sociable towards that individual, because I hear what you said about forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation. That was something new to me, because in my mind, all this time, I thought it was once you forgive someone, it's supposed to be back to reconciliation, but it doesn't necessarily have to go that full route. It can be forgiveness, and you going about your business, I'm going about my business. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting.
Yeah, those are great comments. Yeah, for sure. And I would say, you know, to your point about having that A and B conversation, and then it seems as if they keep acting as if we didn't just have that conversation. There is some merit to having more than one A and B conversation. And a lot of that depends on, this is for anybody's situation, the length of the conversation, how comfortable people were, this and that. Sometimes you may have to come back and revisit an A and B conversation multiple times. That, of course, takes commitment on the part of both parties to be humble enough to keep coming back to have those hard conversations. But yeah, I love how you brought it back to, you know, this fourth bullet point here. Forgiveness does not always equal reconciliation. And that's just so important. We're going to reignite our divorce conversation in a little bit, and then we'll close for the night. But, you know, especially if there has been any kind of abuse, physical abuse, severe emotional, or even spiritual abuse for that matter, it is not wise for both parties to be reconciled, because there may not have been complete healing and wholeness yet on the part of the abuser. So if they are reconciled too early, they may not know how to handle that, and then they end up committing the same sin again. And then this is how you get into cycles of abuse, right? They can misinterpret that act of reconciliation, if they're not whole enough yet themselves, as permission to do what they did before again. And this is how individuals end up being, you know, so seriously traumatized, because I followed what the Bible said. I took him back, this and that. And it's like, well, the Bible is not necessarily calling you to do everything at once. It may be wise to space this out until that individual is at the point where they are whole enough to be reconciled, such that you can be protected from them, or vice versa, right? So that the other party can be protected from you. Kind of like what the song was saying at the end, right? Forgive me when I am one of those people. Mm-hmm. Anyone else have any questions, comments about this right here?
Minister Stephen, this is Sister Cozy.
Hi, Sister.
Hi, I'd just like to say this subject tonight is one that you could teach on Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday. And I think that we would still come up with the same solution or non-solution, because I find that I've not found actually a solution to guarding myself or protecting myself from hurt. And I find that I take that back. My solution is to just remove myself totally and completely. Mm-hmm. I bear no ill will against anyone, but I find that, like Sister Funchess was saying, sometimes if that scab keeps coming back and coming back and coming back, then you're like, okay, now what am I supposed to do? But I find it easier for me to remove myself from the situation or from the person.
Mm-hmm. Me too, actually. Just personally, that's kind of my disposition.
Okay.
Yeah, that is my personal disposition, is to a fault.
Yes.
Only once. That's it.
Okay. Then I feel okay about it.
I mean, I'm not saying that my disposition is right. I don't know the disposition of Jesus, but I get what you're saying. I relate to that. Yeah, it's just complete removal, shut down. You know, oh, I trust you. Oh, you violated that trust. Done. You know.
Okay.
Yeah, I get it. I get
Excellent.
it.
Excellent
And
lesson
these are
tonight.
the texts that just, yes, are
Mhm.
some of the hardest to me. It's okay,
Right,
So,
right.
with the few minutes we have left, let's take a look at Matthew chapter 19. We're going to look at the first part of it. Matthew chapter 19. So you will recall our teaching on Jesus and divorce from earlier in this course on the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus gives another teaching on divorce. So let's read it. Matthew chapter 19, beginning at verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond, the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him. Here it is again. They tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. That's just a direct quotation from Genesis. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. So there's a lot going on here. What I want to do is just re-present to you the notes that we took earlier in this class on Jesus and divorce. So if you were there for that class and you took those notes, you don't have anything new to write down unless you just really want to write some things down again. So it's always so important to bring out the overall context. Jesus is teaching in an easy divorce culture. Husbands easily divorced wives for no good reason. This often left a woman vulnerable in society because, as you know well, women at this time did not have nearly the same amount of rights that they would have in modern society. And so if a husband decided to divorce his wife, he basically left her without money, without honor in an honor-shame society, and without much prospect of getting remarried because she was kind of considered to be damaged goods in many cases. And so the woman's life was in many ways just ruined if the husband decided to divorce her for no reason, just because, I just feel like getting a divorce. So this is a justice issue on the part of Jesus. Jesus upholds, this is important to say, the original intention for marriage, okay? Original intention, as in pre-fall, pre-entrance of sin. Original intention for marriage is one man, one woman, become one, remain one. I'm going to say that again. One man, one woman, become one, remain one. One is repeated 4 times there on purpose. One, and one. Stay together as one. That's the original intention for marriage. And Jesus is not going against that, of course. You know, he is second person of the Trinity. He was there in the act of creation. He kind of set the whole thing up in the first place. So he upholds what was originally designed. But what we begin to see here is that Jesus also recognizes the complexity of this now post-fall. And this is when he kind of enters into the Moses conversation with the Pharisees. And so once again, we see here that Jesus specifically cites sexual immorality on the part of one spouse as a legitimate reason for the other spouse to divorce him or her. I mean, he says it so in verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. So there is that condition, right? If there is sexual immorality, then one spouse is legitimately or even legally, within the context of the kingdom, permitted to divorce that other spouse. Okay. Now, here's the question that comes out of this. Is sexual immorality the only reason a believer can divorce? What about physical and emotional abuse? So let's just say you have, in a hypothetical situation, a husband that is beating his wife, but he has not committed any sexual immorality. Super hypothetical situation. Is the Bible, is Jesus telling that woman to stay in the marriage? And if she were to get a divorce and perhaps even remarry someone else, is the Bible, is Jesus saying that in doing so she's committing adultery? These are like really important questions for the church to get right, because it deals with people's real life. And so you'll recall that I presented two interpretive groups on this. So interpretive group A would say sexual immorality is the only reason for divorce. Okay, the emphasis here is on remaining committed. And here's the explanation. I really want you to pay attention to why those in interpretive group A argue what they argue. No other reasons are explicitly mentioned by Jesus. And so if you're an interpretive group A, the way that you read this text along with the Bible as a whole is you don't want to add if it's not explicitly mentioned. And so since sexual immorality is the only reason explicitly mentioned, this is the only legitimate reason that we can then put forth to the body. Believers cannot assume that it's allowed. Now, many in interpretive group A would still argue that there may need to be some physical separation, okay, woman or man, because men can be physically or emotionally or spiritually or economically abused in a marriage as well. So there may need to be some physical separation, but there should not be a legal divorce. This is interpretive group A. Interpretive group B would say any circumstance that is like, keyword is like, sexual immorality is a legitimate reason for divorce. The emphasis, if you are in interpretive group B, is on the spirit of Jesus's ethic to protect the vulnerable. Again, going back to the context, right? This is an easy divorce culture. The explanation here is that sexual immorality shatters oneness in a marriage. Likewise, anything else that shatters oneness, i.e. physical, emotional abuse, is in fact a legitimate reason to divorce, consistent, with the ethic of Jesus. Both interpretive groups agree that I'm bored, he's not what I thought he was, she doesn't cook like my mama, I don't like his friends, she spends too much money, are illegitimate reasons for divorce, inconsistent with the ethic of Jesus. Okay, so, you know, these reasons that you see here on screen would be interpretive group C, and they weren't worth mentioning, right? Of just, yeah, any reason why you want to get divorced. Get married, get divorced, get married, get divorced, who cares? Okay, no one in A or B is saying that. So, again, as I mentioned to you in the Sermon on the Mount, I happen to land in interpretive group B on this, and my reason is layered, but in part, sexual immorality shatters oneness in a marriage, but so does physical and emotional abuse. And I think what Jesus is really getting at in mentioning sexual immorality is not that in particular as much as it is the shattered oneness between one spouse and another. I mean, some type of deep pain or wound. And so he didn't necessarily need to mention something like physical or emotional abuse. I think that it's implied in the text, and not just this particular text, but if you are reading all of the texts in the Bible that speak of marriage and divorce, I think thrust of it is the ethic is on protecting the vulnerable. If there's an individual in the marriage who is not repentant of their actions, is continuing to harm, and one person is in danger, I would say, and this is not an official position of the church, I don't even know where all of you land on this, I'm saying this is me, I would say that Jesus of Nazareth and the Bible would permit that individual to legally divorce and remarry and experience perhaps happiness and joy with another human being. And in so doing, not be committing adultery. I think the committing of adultery is for the individuals who just easily divorce and move on to someone else because, you know, she doesn't cook like my mama. The other thing that I will say about this briefly is, again, the original design is to remain one, and that always needs to be brought back out, right? What we're seeing here is what happens when things get complex and when things get messy and when people act as people. So I think everyone needs to wrestle with this and understand where you land on this personally. You know, if somebody calls you and asks, hey, you know, what should I do or what should so-and-so do? I think we should be able to articulate decently well what we recognize the scriptures to be saying. Because like I said, this is people's real lives. This gets into the most sensitive matters of life. And I think the church should have a quality response. So with that being said, that was forgiveness and interpersonal relationships in the kingdom of God. As we close tonight, is there anyone who has any closing questions, comments, things they want to bring out to the group?
I do. Okay, so I thought it was interesting during this reading, and this kept floating in my head. I found it interesting that it was always husbands divorcing wives, not wives divorcing husbands. And I know it was he who finds a wife finds a good thing. Everything is initiated basically by the man, but I found it interesting that because there is reciprocal abuse, you know, between both parties, it can be. But I thought it was interesting that it addresses husbands easily divorcing wives, or and it wasn't like wives divorcing husbands, because I know there are some wives who would divorce.
Yeah.
Back in that society, easily divorceable,
Sure.
you know, society back then. But it's like they were a wife and that's it, you know.
Sure.
They couldn't come out of it unless the husband divorced them. But again, that also takes me to that mindset where you said it would bring shame to them and they were considered damaged goods and all that. But
yeah, it was probably a rare woman who would have wanted to initiate divorce. I'm sure there were some, you know, there were probably some who were ready to get out, but yeah, it was probably fairly rare. It's a good comment. Anyone else have any comments they want to bring out to the group? What I want to do right now, and again, feel free to chime in whenever, I just want to take us to the syllabus while my screen is still being shared. So we only have 2 classes left, which is kind of crazy that this is already getting ready to end, and it feels like it just kind of got started. So we have 1 class in the month of November, and that is on November 10th, in which we are going to look at Jesus in Matthew chapters 21 through 25. Whereas we would have met on the 24th, because that's the every other, we're not going to have class because that's Thanksgiving week. And, you know, we may not all be gathering or anything like that in the same way, but we'll be cooking and doing some stuff. So we're not going to have class on that day. But we will come back on December 1st with our final class for Theology of Matthew, and that will be on Jesus in Matthew 26 through 28, in which we will look at the climax, not only of Matthew's gospel, but of the entire biblical story, Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So 2 classes left, November 10th and December 1st. Stop sharing my screen now. Well, it was good seeing you all. Enjoy the rest of your evenings and the next 2 weeks. Happy to dialogue with anyone via email or elsewhere. Last thing I'll point out, if ever you are looking for any of the recordings from this class, they are all in a playlist on YouTube. And I can email out that playlist, but every week I've been uploading the teachings to the playlist. And so I'll just send out the playlist and it'll have all the teachings from this class recorded from the first week till this one, which will be up in just a moment. So, with that being all, good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.